However, on the other hand, the being managing the man is a whole. Although it has left a small part of its own energies outside of the magnetic field of brain cells, that part, as well, in accordance with its wholeness and the necessity of its evolution, is not completely separate from the body but in a close relation with it. Nevertheless, its freedom is not complete. Actually, by means of the close relations between these two parts, that being utilizes the activities that aim at the evolution of its parts connected to the body in world, and by this way, the imperative of embodiment is realized. The out-of-the-body state of the being does not directly impact on the consciousness of mankind. 4. Man can only become conscious with a certain part of the influences sent out to him by the being, and he tries to comprehend himself incompletely. Although, having some vague intuition of the parts that are not coming to him, he has nevertheless no clear comprehension about these. So, what mankind calls inner being, essential self, essence being, and sometimes intuit through a deep contemplation, are the relatively free states of his true being outside the body. We say relatively because although it is free, it is still obliged to follow all states of the body, to render the necessities of those states in accordance with the imperative of its duties in the world. This is its duty. Unless, with the death of the body, its connected parts become unconnected, it cannot use its free parts with complete freedom. 4. Indirectly, it cannot free itself completely from the imperatives of the body via its connected parts. There are compulsory fields of occupation which will always preoccupy it with its activities on its body, such as digesting, concluding the impressions it receives from the body through its parts connected to the body, in accordance with the evolutionary imperatives particular to that moment, and reflecting these to spirit. As for the necessities of evolution, the being once in a while reflects a few parts of the values and acquisitions existing in itself to the brain. And mankind has noticed these influences, again, without properly understanding their disposition, which are reflected from these free parts of their beings to their brains, and has termed them the subconscious. Therefore, consciousness in man is the manifestation of these parts reflected to the body, more correctly, to the magnetic field synthesis constituted by brain cells, through the direct connection made by the being. There is also, as we have said, a superconsciousness field of the being belonging to its unconnected parts that have stayed in a perceptual gathering point outside of the body, and are not connected to the magnetic field of the brain, which should be discussed in two parts. One of these is subconscious. This field comprises the parts containing impressions pertaining to the past lives of the being. The second part we call higher consciousness, containing the influences constantly received from its spirit and other beings by the being's part which has stayed free. So, as a result of their relations of consciousness with higher consciousness, relations and exchanges are built between the influences mankind receives from other beings of the spiritual plan and their consciousness. The brain connects to the higher consciousness through the spiritual influences it receives. That is, impressions belonging to the spiritual plan arrive at it via the higher conscious channel. Therefore, there are innumerable nervous systems which take the influences from the consciousness field, which is the basic center, and consign these to necessary places in order to be used, which are not centers in themselves, but stations. And even the influences spreading out to the organism do separate functions, their source is one, and they are always interrelated. Influences come from the superconsciousness, and arrive at the field which is directly connected to the magnetic channel of the brain cells of the being. And from there, in accordance with evolutionary necessities, they are sent out to the nervous stations in order to be used in required places for the survival of the body. Therefore, mankind is always facing both the influences they receive from their beings, and also the influences they receive from their surroundings. And man lives in the equilibrium of the influences coming from his essence being, and the influences he receives from his surroundings in the world. What happens when the body dies? When death, which mankind calls, again mistakenly, disincarnation occurs, the beings of the brain cells leave their bodies, that is, the brain cells they incarnated into. However, they do not disperse, because the being that needs to leave the body does not remove its influence over them, even after it leaves its body. With the influences it continues sending to the magnetic fields of these beings, it keeps them together and under its influence in the spatium, as well. Naturally, it also receives influences from them. At the initial stages of the spatium, as we will later explain, all influences and connections of a being coming from above, below, and the surroundings are severed, except the influences coming from its own spirit. It is only encircled within its own being and the impressions of its subconscious, especially belonging to its last life. And during this time, because it is continuously in relation with the beings of its brain cells, it can collect and make compositions out of the impressions which also exist in those beings, pertaining to the world. This activity, although most often causing much suffering, offers it the possibility to do the required contemplation. After acquiring the necessary results with this contemplation, its awakening and the increase in its comprehension are ensured again by the influences coming from above and the surroundings. Then, it enters a state of ability to understand its true being. Naturally, in the meantime, beings of the brain cells have also evolved of their own accord. By this means, after subjecting it to some very long applications and processes and its completing the preparation for entering the world once again, it is given the right to choose forms and conditions of its life within a field of available possibilities, which are most suitable for its evolution in the world. The scope of this field, that is, the field of choices offered to it, depends on the degree of freedom it has acquired in accordance with its comprehension. If its comprehension is too narrow, this field would be very narrow for it, and in some cases, a very limited, almost nil field of choices are left to it. If its comprehension is expanded enough to encompass the whole world, then there remains no need to re-embody and do applications in the world. So, in this way, after it prepares its surroundings in the world in relation to its freedom of choice, it consigns the beings of brain cells which it kept under its influence, by influencing their magnetic fields, to the mother's body, in order for them to build a fetus brain in that mother's womb, and the process we previously explained begins afresh under new conditions. However, it should never be forgotten that because it is an imperative that all of these deeds should advance in accordance with the divine order, the constant supervision and control of sublime influences and administrative energy complexes, which allows these is always present here, as it is everywhere. We would like to point out as well that the beings of brain cells, which are under the influence of the being always governing the man, will not stay connected to it forever. For, they do the necessary preparations for themselves as well, in order to acquire the power to manage a human body apiece independently. And as they complete their preparations, they will separate themselves from the influence of that being one by one and will cease to be a brain cell. For them each to enter the stage of independent human beings, they need to separate from the world and go through applications in some interval years outside of the world. Only by this, and after reaching a state of ability to manage a human whole, again by influencing the magnetic field synthesis of the brain cells of a man, do they start to render their evolutions in the world as humans, that is, through the human body. After this knowledge, the expression of the embodiment of human being should be understood in this wider meaning and should not be thought to be in a narrow frame, such as the concept of incarnation, which means entrance in the flesh. The term of incarnation may be used for simpler beings which are consigned to connect into cells by force. However, it is not true for a human being. Therefore, the relation of a man with a body occurs in the form of its governance upon the magnetic field of its brain cells, and sending out its influences via this vehicle throughout its organism. And this is ensured by a major part of the influences that are sent out from that perceptual point we have mentioned to the body. And a small part of its influences always exist, more or less freely, in that point outside of the body.